I've been sitting on this story for years, and I'm still not sure why I'm finally typing it out now. Maybe it's age. Maybe it's guilt. Or maybe it's just that quiet, 2 a.m. feeling where your past gets loud enough that you can't ignore it anymore. For context, my name's William. I'm not proud of most of what I did in my 20s, and this is one of those things that still sneaks up on me when I least expect it. I stole an expensive painting from a gallery late one night, something I had no business touching, let alone taking. It wasn't some impulsive smash and grab. It was planned, deliberate, and fueled by a mix of desperation and ego that I didn't recognize as dangerous at the time. I wasn't some master criminal, despite how I probably imagined myself back then. I was broke, angry, and convinced the world owed me something for my talent and bad luck. The painting became a symbol in my head, proof that I was smarter than the system, that I could take something beautiful and valuable without being seen. I told myself it wasn't really hurting anyone. Galleries had insurance, right? That's the lie I clung to. Even now, writing this, I can still feel that constant hum of fear I carried with me that night. It never left, not during the planning, not during the act, not even afterward. And that fear, more than anything else, is why I'm sharing this here. Because no matter how clever you think you are, it follows you. Always. If you're still reading, I'll tell the whole story. Just know this isn't a brag. It's a confession. The thing people don't talk about enough is how crimes rarely start with a single moment. They creep in. For me, it started months before I ever stepped foot in that gallery after hours. I used to visit the place during the day, pretending I was just another art nerd killing time. Truth is, I was obsessed with one painting in particular. It wasn't even the most famous piece there, but it had this presence, dark colors, sharp movement, the kind of thing that makes you feel watched. I'd stand in front of it longer than was normal, long enough that one of the guards once asked if I was okay. I laughed it off, but something had already clicked in my head. At the time, I was barely scraping by. Rent overdue, phone blowing up with missed calls from numbers I didn't want to answer. I felt invisible and powerless, and that painting started to represent the opposite of that. It was valuable, desired, protected, and in some twisted way, I wanted to prove I could take it. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd figure something out afterward. Sell it, return it anonymously, whatever fantasy made me feel less like a thief. The real motive, though? I wanted control. I wanted to feel like I could bend the world just once in my favor. Once that thought settled in, it didn't go away. Every time I passed the gallery, my chest tightened, not with fear yet, but with anticipation. That's when I should have stopped. Instead, I started thinking about how I never sat down and said, "Okay, tonight I'd become a criminal." That's not how it felt. What I did instead was collect little bits of information and pretend they were harmless. Observations. Curiosity. Nothing more. I noticed patterns first. Not specifics, just rhythms. When the gallery felt crowded versus quiet. How the staff shifted moods near closing time. Which doors were used often and which seemed forgotten. I told myself this was normal, the kind of thing anyone would notice if they spent enough time in one place. Deep down, I knew I was lying to myself, but it was a comfortable lie. At home, I started running scenarios in my head the way some people rehearse arguments in the shower. What if this went wrong? What if that happened instead? I wasn't drawing blueprints or anything dramatic. It was more like mental chess, one move ahead, then another. I kept telling myself that thinking wasn't the same as doing. The preparation bled into my everyday life. I dressed differently, nothing flashy, nothing memorable. I avoided talking about the gallery with friends because I was afraid my interest would sound too intense. Even my sleep changed. I'd wake up wired, heart already racing, as if my body knew what my mind refused to say out loud. The strangest part? I felt proud of myself. Calm on the surface, chaotic underneath. I mistook that feeling for confidence when it was really the first warning sign that I was drifting too far from who I thought I was. There was a moment, I can still pinpoint it, when this stopped being a fantasy and became real. I didn't cross a fence or break a lock or anything dramatic like that. I just realized I had already decided to do it. I remember standing in my apartment one evening, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked normal. Boring, even. And I thought, no one would ever suspect you. That thought should have scared me. Instead, it felt like permission. I started justifying things faster than I could question them. I wasn't hurting a person directly. I wasn't violent. I wasn't some reckless idiot doing this for kicks. At least that's what I told myself. I framed it as calculated, controlled, almost intellectual. Like I was testing a system rather than stealing from it. That's when I began gathering what I needed. Again, nothing dramatic. Just making sure I wouldn't stand out, that I could move without drawing attention, that I didn't leave behind obvious traces of myself. Every small decision felt heavy, like it carried more weight than it should have. The fear started to creep in around then. Not enough to stop me, but enough to sharpen everything. Sounds felt louder. Time felt slower. I'd catch myself thinking about consequences, handcuffs, headlines, my mother finding out, and I'd physically shake my head, like I could dislodge the thoughts. Looking back, this was the last clean exit. I could have walked away and just been a guy who almost did something stupid. Instead, I kept going, telling myself that the hardest part was already over. It wasn't. I picked a night that felt unremarkable on purpose. No big events, no buzz, nothing that would make the gallery more alert than usual. I told myself blending in was the goal, even though there was nothing normal about what I was about to do. The hours leading up to it were strange. I cleaned my apartment like I was going away for a while, even though I had no plans to. I ate a meal I barely tasted. I checked my pockets over and over, not because I was afraid of forgetting something important, but because my hands needed something to do. My heart wouldn't slow down. On the walk over, every passing car felt suspicious. Every stranger's glance lingered a second too long. I kept thinking someone would stop me and ask where I was going, like the universe itself might intervene. No one did. The city didn't care. That realization was unsettling in its own way. When I finally reached the area near the gallery, I didn't go straight in. I paced. I pretended to check my phone. I stood there arguing with myself in circles. You can still leave. You're already here. If not now, when? It felt less like bravery and more like momentum pushing me forward. The building looked different at night. Colder. Less inviting. The kind of place that made you feel small once the lights dimmed and the doors were closed. I remember thinking that once I stepped closer, I'd be crossing some invisible line. Not a legal one, something personal. And when I finally did, the fear didn't vanish like I'd imagined. It got sharper. Focused. Like my body had switched into a mode I didn't know it had. That was the moment I understood there was no version of this where I walked away unchanged. Getting inside wasn't cinematic. No alarms blaring, no dramatic soundtrack. Just a quiet, tense series of moments where every tiny sound felt like it could ruin everything. The building seemed to breathe differently after hours, like it was holding its own secrets. I remember freezing more than once, convinced I'd heard footsteps or a voice. Most of the time it was just the hum of the building settling, or my own blood rushing in my ears. I'd never been so aware of my body, how loud my breathing felt, how my shoes sounded against the floor, how badly my hands were shaking even when I tried to steady them. The gallery spaces looked wrong without people. Art is supposed to be seen, judged, absorbed. At night, it felt like I was trespassing in something sacred. The paintings stared back at me under dim lighting, and for a split second I wondered if I was about to become one of those cautionary stories they tell new employees. I stuck to what I'd rehearsed in my head, moving slowly, avoiding anything that felt unpredictable. Still, nothing prepares you for how fragile confidence is in a moment like that. One mistake, One wrong assumption, and I knew it would all collapse. When I finally reached the room where that painting hung, my stomach dropped. Seeing it alone, unguarded except by systems I couldn't fully see, made it feel more real than it ever had during the day. This wasn't an idea anymore. I was standing right in front of the thing that had consumed my thoughts for months. And that's when the fear really set in, not the abstract kind, but the kind that makes you wonder if you've already gone too far to turn back. Standing there, I didn't rush. That surprised me. I thought I'd be frantic, clumsy, desperate to get it over with. Instead, time stretched. My brain felt sharp and useless at the same time, cataloging details I'd never care about again. The faint smell of cleaning solution, the soft whir of air circulation, the way the frame caught the light. I kept expecting something to interrupt me. A voice over a speaker. A door opening. Even a phone vibrating in my pocket. Nothing happened. The silence felt intentional, like the building was watching to see what I'd do next. Up close, the painting was heavier than I expected, not just physically, but emotionally. It hit me that this thing had history. Hands had touched it before mine. People had argued about it, loved it, hated it. And here I was, about to rip it out of its place like it was just another object. My hands hesitated. I remember whispering, "Okay," to myself, like you do before jumping into cold water. That was the last moment where I felt fully in control. The second I committed, my body took over and my thoughts scattered. Every sound I made felt amplified. The slightest shift echoed in my skull. I was painfully aware that if something went wrong now, there would be no clean explanation, no clever way out. I wasn't a visitor anymore. I was exactly what the signs warned about. And yet, mixed in with the fear, there was this ugly spark of excitement. A rush that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. That realization scared me more than getting caught. I wish I could say everything unfolded exactly how I'd imagine, but that's never how these things work. The second the painting came free, something shifted, not just in my head, but in the room itself. A soft sound, barely more than a click, cut through the silence. Not loud. Not obvious. But enough to make my heart slam into my ribs. I froze. Completely. My brain started screaming possibilities at me all at once. Alarm. Sensor. Timer. You messed up. I stood there holding this priceless piece of art, suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. For a few seconds, I don't know how many, I didn't even breathe. Nothing happened right away, which somehow made it worse. No sirens. No lights. Just that awful waiting, like the pause before thunder. I debated putting it back, undoing everything, pretending I was never there. The problem was, I had no idea if that would make things better or much, much worse. That's when I heard movement somewhere far off. Footsteps? A door? It could have been my imagination, but fear doesn't care about accuracy. Fear only cares about now. I told myself I had seconds, even if that wasn't true. My hands were slick with sweat. I remember thinking how stupid it was that I'd worried about being calm, about being precise. None of that mattered anymore. This was pure instinct, every nerve firing at once, my body begging me to leave. I didn't feel clever or powerful in that moment. I felt small. Exposed. Like the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting to see if I'd crack. Leaving should have been easier. That's what I told myself. In reality, it was chaos wrapped in silence. My exit route suddenly felt unfamiliar, like the building had rearranged itself just to mess with me. Every shadow looked like a person. Every corner felt like a mistake waiting to happen. I moved too fast at first, then forced myself to slow down, terrified that rushing would draw attention I couldn't afford. My thoughts were a mess, half of me replaying that faint click over and over, the other half screaming at me to just go. I kept expecting someone to appear and ask a simple question I wouldn't be able to answer. At one point I heard voices. Real ones this time. Muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. I pressed myself still and waited, clutching the thing that had caused all of this like it was both a prize and a curse. My legs were burning from the tension of holding position, my lungs aching because I was barely breathing. When the voices faded, relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I felt this deep, nauseating shame. I wasn't outsmarting anyone. I was hiding. Panicking. Hoping the world would look the other way while I did something unforgivable. By the time I finally made it outside, the air felt wrong, too open, too exposed. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hunted, like I'd stolen something that didn't want to leave quietly. And even though no one stopped me, no one shouted, no alarms chased me into the night, I knew something important had already been lost. Not the painting. Something in me. I didn't go home right away. That felt like the dumbest possible move, even in my panic state. Instead, I walked. Block after block, changing direction for no real reason other than the need to feel like I was shaking something off. Every car that slowed near me made my shoulders tense. Every passing stranger felt like a threat. I kept replaying the night in fragments. The click. The voices. The way my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I told myself I'd calm down once I put some distance between me and the gallery, but the fear came with me. It settled into my chest like it had paid rent. When I finally did stop, it was somewhere anonymous and dim. I checked the painting like a nervous parent checking on a sleeping child, irrational, compulsive. It was fine. Untouched. Still beautiful. Still expensive. And somehow that made me feel worse. Seeing it outside the gallery, stripped of context, made the whole thing feel uglier. Less romantic. More criminal. I started thinking about cameras I might have missed. About that sound again. About how long it would take before someone noticed. My brain kept jumping ahead to consequences, knocks on doors, questions I couldn't answer, explanations I couldn't sell. I rehearsed lies I hoped I'd never have to tell. The worst part was realizing there was no off switch. I'd crossed the line, and now everything felt like evidence, including myself. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't proud. I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop, wondering if it already had and I just didn't know it yet. The days after were worse than the night itself. I went back to my routine like nothing had happened, and that normalcy felt obscene. I stood in line for coffee, answered emails, nodded along in conversations, all while carrying this heavy, invisible thing with me. Every laugh felt fake. Every quiet moment felt dangerous. I checked the news obsessively. Not just headlines, local blurbs, community posts, anything that might hint at what I'd done. When nothing showed up right away, I didn't feel relief. I felt dread. It was like knowing a storm had formed somewhere offshore and waiting to see when it would make landfall. Sleep became a joke. I jolted awake convinced I'd heard a knock, a siren, my name being called. When I did manage to rest, the dreams were vivid and cruel, hallways that never ended, rooms full of eyes, my hands empty where the painting should have been. I'd wake up soaked in sweat, heart racing, already exhausted. I told no one. Not a friend, not a stranger, not even myself in a way that felt honest. I minimized it in my head, framed it as a temporary situation, a problem I'd handle, once things cooled down. But the truth was, I didn't know what handling it even meant anymore. The painting sat hidden, untouched, like a loaded question. I avoided looking at it unless I had to. It felt less like something I owned and more like something that owned me. And with each passing day, the thrill faded completely, replaced by a quiet, grinding anxiety that made me wonder if this constant fear, was the real price of what I'd done. About a week in, the gallery finally showed up in my life again, just not the way I expected. A coworker mentioned it casually, like it was nothing. "Did you hear about that theft?" he asked, scrolling his phone. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might actually pass out at my desk. I kept my face neutral, nodded like I was half listening. Inside, everything was screaming. He said they were keeping details quiet. that investigators were reviewing footage, that they weren't sure how it happened yet. Each sentence felt like a countdown. What messed with me was how ordinary the conversation was. No drama. No outrage. Just another piece of news sandwiched between complaints about traffic and lunch plans. I realized then how small I really was in the grand scheme of things, and how huge this felt inside my own head. That night, paranoia took over. I convinced myself every unfamiliar sound was someone outside. I wiped down surfaces that didn't need wiping. I rehearsed explanations for questions no one had asked yet. I even caught myself practicing what I'd say if I turned myself in, like that was a real option I was brave enough to take. I tried justifying it again, one last time. No one was hurt. It's just an object. You'll fix this. But the words rang hollow. The truth was, I wasn't in control anymore. I was reacting, flinching, waiting. And maybe that was the punishment, not sirens or handcuffs, but this constant sense that the walls were closing in, slowly, patiently, on their own schedule. At some point, fear turns into something duller. Heavier. I stopped jumping at every noise, not because I felt safe, but because I was exhausted. That's when I started thinking less about getting caught, and more about how to live with what I'd done. I considered getting rid of the painting more times than I can count. Every option felt wrong. Selling it meant involving someone else, expanding the circle of damage. Returning it anonymously sounded noble in theory, but terrifying in practice. I imagined cameras catching my face, fingerprints I'd missed, a decision that would somehow make everything worse. So I did nothing, which I convinced myself was a choice. I tried to compartmentalize. During the day, I was normal William. Bills, work, small talk. At night, the other version of me showed up, the one replaying decisions, questioning motives, wondering when I'd become someone capable of this. I hated that version, but I couldn't get rid of him. What really got to me was how the story changed in my head. At first, it was sharp and vivid. Then it started to blur, like my mind was sanding down the edges to protect itself. I caught myself rewriting moments, minimizing the fear, downplaying the risk. That scared me almost as much as the crime itself. If I could lie to myself this easily, what else was I capable of? The painting remained hidden, untouched, like a secret neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I told myself I'd deal with it. Soon. Soon became days. Days became weeks. And somewhere in that stretch of time, I realized that even if no one ever found out, I'd still be carrying this forever. That was when it hit me. Getting away with it didn't feel like winning. It felt like a sentence. Months passed. No knock on the door. No call. No sudden unraveling. On paper, I got away with it. That's the version people think they want, the clean escape, the untouched future. What no one tells you is how quietly that kind of ending rewires you. I became cautious in ways that didn't make sense to anyone else. I avoided eye contact with authority figures. I flinched at questions that had nothing to do with me. I started assuming guilt before innocence in every situation, like the world had shifted and I was finally seeing its real face. Or maybe just my own. I didn't feel clever anymore. I felt smaller. Like I'd carved out a part of myself and left a hollow where confidence used to live. Even on good days, there was this low-level hum of self-disgust. Not dramatic, not loud, just persistent. The kind that shows up when you're alone and honest. The painting eventually left my possession. I won't get into how. Not because I'm protecting myself, but because it doesn't matter. What mattered was that letting it go didn't give me the relief I'd been banking on. There was no emotional reset, no forgiveness from the universe moment. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the object was never the real problem. I started seeing my past differently, not just that night, but all the choices that led there. The shortcuts. The rationalizations. The way I'd learned to excuse myself when things got uncomfortable. It was unsettling to realize that the crime wasn't an outlier. It was a culmination. That understanding didn't ruin me, but it changed me. It forced me to confront the version of myself I'd been avoiding, and whether I was willing to keep being him. If you're expecting a neat moral here, I don't really have one. Life doesn't wrap things up that cleanly. What I can tell you is this: the worst part of what I did wasn't the risk of jail or public shame. It was learning how easy it was to cross a line once I'd talked myself into it. I used to think people who committed crimes were fundamentally different from everyone else, bolder, colder, wired wrong. I know better now. Most of the time, it's just someone who keeps saying it's not that bad until one day it is. That's how it starts. Quietly. Logically. Convincingly. If you're reading this and you're standing near your own line, whatever that looks like for you, my advice is boring but honest. Walk away while you still recognize yourself. Not because you'll definitely get caught, but because getting away with it changes you in ways you don't get to undo. The fear fades. The guilt dulls. But the knowledge sticks. I don't share this for sympathy. I don't think I deserve it. I'm sharing it because I wish someone had told me that the thrill isn't worth the permanent weight it leaves behind. That being able to do something doesn't mean you should. That silence can be louder than consequences. This is just one story from my life. One crime among others. But it's the one that taught me the most, about control, about self-deception, and about how thin the line is between who you think you are and who you're capable of becoming.